Sometimes it bugs me that Armstrong and Shepard get all the credit. But we all wanted to win the Cold War. And we were ready to commit our lives to getting the biomedal. The military boys used all the material that had fallen to Earth. And they still needed more. They went looking for a few cowboys to do the job. And in the end, they orchestrated the world's biggest cover-up. They snuck a whole army into space and not a soul knew a thing. But now it's time. People should know why it was so important that we won the space race. People should know what happened to all those who went missing. The dead should get their honors, and they should have their place in history. Because history has a way of repeating itself.
Satellite enabled.
Battlezone: Rise of the Black Dogs is a flawed but ambitious port of the 1998 PC cult classic Battlezone, which is affectionately known by fans as Battlezone 98. Reviews of the N64 title at the time were mixed at best, with IGN giving the game a 3.9 out of 10. Apparently, they didn't think there was a little something for everyone. This port was developed by Climax Studios, who is still around today as part of Keyword Studios, and published by the ever-mediocre Crave Entertainment. Crave published mainly forgettable license titles, shovelware, and Gex 3 Deep Cover Gecko, oddly enough. This is like publishing games at Kerry Fernandez's house.
It's tail time.
There is a ton of information about Battlezone 98 out there, as well as the fairly recent Battlezone 98 Redux, a solid remaster of the PC game done by Big Boat Interactive. But other than a few random gameplay videos and an old review or two, you won't find much about the N64 version. Speedrun.com doesn't even have a page for it. You hear that, speedrunners? Go claim your free world record. To understand the context of the N64 port Rise of the Black Dogs, we have to understand a little bit about Battlezone, the PC game. Battlezone 98 was released by Activision in 1998. The only real similarity it bears to the arcade games is that it focused around tanks. Battlezone 98 smashed together a lot of different genres. There's elements of FPS, RTS, tower defense, and even some sniping here and there. The game is set against an alternate history space race where the United States and Soviet Union are having a secret space war across the solar system, fighting to find a resource known as biometal that can be used to make incredible technology and weapons. One thing that drew me into this game was the fact that all the maps take place on interpretations of real planets from the solar system and moons from the gas giants. There are of course liberties taken with the science of the planets, and there are some fictional planets introduced later on, but you could tell that effort was put into portraying Venus, Ganymede, Io, and others the way they might actually look on their surfaces, as well as you could do with a 1998 PC anyway. Gameplay itself is the aforementioned mishmash. It sounds very complicated at first, but everything makes perfect sense once you've played a few missions. The game does a good job at introducing new units and concepts to you over time, so that by the time the later missions come around, you know exactly what each unit does and what it's for. Success or failure then becomes about how well you use your units and resources given to you on each mission. In Battlezone, the Recycler is the cornerstone of your forces. The Recycler allows for creation of basic units like scouts, turrets, and scavengers, as well as the units that make more advanced units and ammo types like factories, constructors, and armories. As the commander, you're in charge of telling these units when and where to build and where to deploy. In addition to these more strategic units, you are also capable of producing a wide variety of tanks that serve different purposes, such as bombers, scouts, rocket tanks, defensive walkers, and more. All of this stuff is made with the aforementioned biometal, which your scavengers will pick up. In addition to having biometal, you are also limited by the number of pilots that you have available to you. You have to use pilots to pilot these tanks and other vehicles. This isn't just an invisible resource. These pilots are actual characters who can be seen walking on the battlefield when their vehicles are destroyed. Normally they will attempt to return back to your base unless they engage an enemy on foot, but individual pilots out of a tank are very weak and can be killed with one shot by a tank. If one of these pilots dies, your pilot count decreases, and you'll have less manpower to accomplish your goals. The kicker to all of this is that it applies to you too. Instead of being some omnipotent, abstract figure that issues orders from somewhere else, you're a pilot just like your men. The only difference between you and them is that you are given the orders. If your tank is destroyed, you'll be ejected high into the sky of whatever planet you're fighting on and given a chance to try to survive. Assuming you're not murdered by whatever blew up your tank, you have a few options to try to make it back to safety. If there are other tanks on your side nearby, you can order one of them to pick you up, and the pilot will pick you up and head back to the base on foot themselves. You could also have your factory recycler make you your favorite vehicle and have a pilot deliver it to you to continue the fight. If you're low on resources, or perhaps too far out for backup, your pilot is equipped with a sniper rifle. If you manage to snipe the pilot of an enemy tank, you can commandeer it yourself. With the exception of 1 or 2 stealth missions though, the enemy won't be fooled by your tank theft auto. But it's a very neat concept that lets you control tanks from enemy factions, and sometimes these are better suited to the needs at hand than the ones from your faction. Having the player function as a normal pilot in the game was a stroke of genius on the developer's part. It provides a believable way for the player to get a second chance when their vehicle is destroyed, and it makes you feel like part of the in-game universe. Imagine fighting a war an unthinkable amount of miles from home, not even on the same planet. Your family doesn't know where you are, nor would they believe you if you could tell them. You've just lost your vehicle, the closest thing you have to a source of safety, and now you're forced to trek across a hostile alien world, alone, in hopes of finding your allies or a way back to the base. It's a truly lonely feeling that Battlezone often manages to capture. These mechanics are all spoon-fed at first, but the more advanced missions give you a wide leash to experiment with all possible avenues to complete it. Not every mission can be done every way, but oftentimes you do have multiple options, whether it's building a large strike force or opting for a more strategic approach, or even using the on-foot mechanics to sneak behind enemy lines and cheese the game's mechanics. I do love a game that doesn't stop you from cheesing it if you can pull it off, and Battlezone lets you do it. While Ubisoft and Rockstar may claim that their open-world games offer you true freedom is the ability to break the game if you know what you're doing, and the best games let you do so. It's why you remember games like Morrowind and Oblivion, but you can't remember any specific experiences you had with the latest Assassin's Creed or Far Cry. The missions themselves are all things that have been done before in video games, before and after Battlezone. Protect this unit, blow this thing up, go here and get this. The fun comes from trying the different maps and their layouts, which provide different challenges. Your most vital units can only deploy on geysers at certain locations on each planet, so you need to think carefully about where to deploy and how you will fortify. Of course, if a position is untenable, you could always uproot and move if you have the forces to take the position you want. I realize that I called this a review of the N64 game, and it is, but trust me, it's really important that you hear all that about Battlezone 98 to get a backdrop of what this title is trying to accomplish as a port. Climax did an excellent job with the game's opening screens and menu. The original game felt very much like a PC game of the time. Very simple, bare-bones menus with few graphics and animations. Before the missions, you would get little shots of the planets you would visit and some stats about each one, but Climax made the entire menu and Rise of the Black Dogs revolve around the solar system itself. This is one thing that drew me into this game as a kid. Yeah, it's N64 graphics, but seeing the planets and their moons represented in 3D amongst this big sci-fi space opera backdrop was just totally awesome. Once you get past the title screen into the main menu, you'll see the solar system in the background as you move, setting up your game. You'll move into the background and the planets themselves eventually. As you scroll between available missions, the camera zooms back and forth between each planet, and it's really nice for giving you an idea of how far you are from home. Speaking of setting up the game, the N64 port has some options which seem to be specifically designed for console players who were unfamiliar with the PC game, which was people like myself back in 2000. In addition to a training mode, you also get the option of Arcade, Pilot, or Commander. Commander is the full Monty FPS RTS hybrid from the PC that we all know and love. You'll manage pilots, biometal reserves, buildings, and your squad in a rootin' tootin' space-faring adventure. Pilot mode uses the same missions from the PC game in Commander mode, however it removes all the strategy and just plays more like the Battlezone would if it were a pure mission-based game like say Perfect Dark or GoldenEye. The objectives are roughly the same as they were in Commander mode, but the bases and units will automatically build themselves and take care of whatever it is you would normally be in charge of directing NPC units to do. For example, in missions where you need to go somewhere and set up a base or a recycler or a factory, any units that you have will just do it themselves. including setting up their own defensive perimeter. You are basically just entrusted with doing the main focus of the mission yourself, while the AI handles base and resource management. The game presents Arcade, Pilot, and Commander as different tiered badges, as if to say one is more challenging than the other. And in a way, I guess it makes sense that you'd consider Commander more difficult than Pilot, but the focus on many gameplay styles is so important to Battlezone's identity, it's almost a totally different game mode rather than a step down in difficulty. As a pilot, you can't call in pickups, more vehicles, or build new units, so you have to change your strategy completely and play the game like some sort of vehicle-based mission game, like Spy Hunter on GameCube or something. I get what they were trying to do, but I think the way pilot mode is presented as a difficulty step down is a problem. I personally had no idea the commander element of the game was even a thing because I just assumed pilot was the normal difficulty for the game and played through it on that the first time I rented this game as a child. When I figured out I could build my own units and buildings with the commander mode, it totally blew my mind. You may recall a few bad jokes back, I mentioned an arcade mode. Arcade mode attempts to recreate the original arcade Battlezone experience, as in an arcade game with tanks. That is, it lets you pick a faction, and it drops you in a simple map based on the main game where you destroy all the enemies and move to the next map till you finish them all. There's no story or objectives, just blasting. Speaking of factions, how do they work? Rise of the Black Dogs gives 3 choices of playable factions: American, Soviet, or Black Dog. All 3 campaigns are canon to the game's story, and none of the missions contradict each other as far as story outcomes. In the PC version, the American or NSDF campaign is the primary one. It's the longest and most well developed. You start out with only a few total units, and the game slowly introduces you to more as you finish the missions. The Americans spend most of the game trying to catch up to the Soviets, who catch them off guard on the moon at the beginning of the game, and later join forces with them to defeat the Furies, a sentient weapon race that the Soviets create and quickly lose control of later in the story. The USA campaign also features more story content in the form of opening and ending narration from the game's player character named Grizzly 1, with simple cutscenes to bookend the beginning and ending of the story of the USA mode, whereas the other campaigns just go straight to the credits after finishing. Loading screens for every mission in the PC version also gave voice narration from Grizzly 1 as he recounted what happened in each mission, but these are totally lost here. Fortunately, the in-mission dialogue was brought over in text form, in the form of transmission boxes that will display text dialogue during gameplay. Unfortunately, they just typed up the text and dumped it without much context as to who is actually speaking to you. There are actually 3 or 4 different speakers in the American and Soviet campaigns that you know all about in the PC version due to their different distinct voice actors. But in the N64 version, this detail is lost, and there are times you won't realize who is speaking to you or even their personality. The Soviet campaign follows semi-closely to the American one, but shows you the other side of events. For example, during the USA campaign, you'll hear about Soviet weapons ambushing other platoons or their successful operations against USA forces elsewhere. The Soviet campaign shows you several of these events that you heard about and lets you play out these scenarios. It's kind of lame that the same effort wasn't put into the Soviet campaign in this or the PC version. There's no ending, and the Soviets' final mission just takes you straight to the credits after you beat it. Thematically, if you finish the USA storyline, you know what happened to the Soviet commander in question though. Most of the Soviet campaign isn't spent fighting the USA NSDF faction, but rather a radical special Black Ops division of the USA forces known as the Black Dogs. The Black Dogs were probably made as a compromise, so you didn't feel so bad about playing as a murderous communist space regime, as the Black Dogs outright refuse to accept Soviet surrender and are portrayed as ruthless and cruel in their battle with the Soviets, taking no prisoners and killing everyone they can. The final Soviet mission involves them activating the Fury superweapon to destroy the Black Dog division and losing control of it, setting up the events of the game's final chapter in the USA campaign. The American and Soviet campaigns are ported directly from the PC version, but the Black Dog campaign is exclusive to the N64 game, although a group of modders was at one point working on porting it to the HD remake of Battlezone 98. The Black Dogs are a bit complicated in Battlezone lore, and yes, there is a lot of Battlezone lore out there to look up and learn about. You see, in the original game, the Black Dogs are never mentioned by name in the American campaign, but they only show up in the Soviet campaign as enemies. Black Dog units are essentially just USA ones with a different logo on the side. After Battlezone 98 was released, an expansion was developed by another company a year later called the Red Odyssey, which stars a different Black Dog platoon than the one the main Soviet force is fighting with. These Black Dog units find themselves under attack from the Chinese, who had joined the fray in secret. Outgunned and heavily outnumbered, the expansion campaign revolves around them pulling back from the brink to survive and defeat the Chinese. The N64 Black Dog campaign features yet another division of the Black Dogs. Their story this time starts toward the end of the USA campaign chronologically and finishes after it. The Black Dogs are for some reason left out of the loop when the ceasefire starts and witness American and Soviet forces working together. Rather than trying to get in touch with someone to ask, they assume that a great conspiracy is afoot and try to make it back to Earth and expose the whole space war. It's an interesting idea just to have a renegade faction trying to expose everyone, but the way it's implemented story-wise is just silly. Continuing with the sad, most of the Black Dog missions in the N64 campaign are poorly done and very hard. Playing in pilot or commander mode won't make much of a difference for these missions, as several of them are just out-and-out combat or destroy this type situations. Like in the PC version, the Black Dogs are just rebranded USA units with different voice actors for when you hail them on the radio. The command does have its highlights though. The Black Dogs have different starting weapons than the NSDF branch, and you'll even try out the totally OP Rave Gun on a few occasions. The high point of the Black Dog campaign is definitely the sections on Mars that are focused on stealing the Mammoth tank from the Soviets. The Mammoth tank is a gigantic prototype tank with 4 cannons as opposed to the standard 1 or 2 turrets most tanks get. Sadly, once you finally get to commandeer and drive this tank, it's only for a short period of time and the mission ends, and then you never get to see it again or create a Black Dog version of it. The Black Dog's final mission is an all-out battle with the Americans and Soviets on the moon, where you have to defend your forces from the Americans and Soviets as your side works to create a launch pad to get back to Earth and tell the world what happened in space. It would have been a great idea to let you use a Black Dog Mammoth tank to blow up tons of enemy tanks with ease here as sort of a final send-off and reward for clearing the Black Dog campaign, but instead they just give you a Rave Gun and call it a day. Yeah, about this multiplayer mode, it's good that they tried, however it's certifiably terrible. The N64 was obviously already pushed to its limit by this game, and this mode feels extremely cheap and thrown together. You can do a deathmatch, which is just you and a friend shooting at each other in tanks, a race, which is, well, a race, and then there's a mode called strategy. If you were thinking this mode would let you and a friend build bases and attack each other, you'd be wrong. Strategy just gives each player a set of AI teammates that will attack the other team on sight. That's it. It's deathmatch with a few bot tanks. The original Battlezone is still played online to this day, thanks to the remaster and years of dedicated content creators making maps and other multiplayer mods. But all of these let you take the strategy element of the main game and use it against another person. One would think this would be where a console version could shine, as a console with 2 controllers would be more conducive to 2 people playing split screen than say 2 people huddled around 1 keyboard and mouse on a single computer. Sadly, the N64's limitations just make it something that's not feasible. Unit selection is already somewhat clunky in the N64 version, so the devs would have instantly run into the problem of limited screen space if the devs even tried to implement a strategy mode. I love the N64. It's my favorite console of all time, but it definitely held back this port of Battlezone. Even though the game can make use of the N64 expansion pack for extra memory, graphically the game is much lower res than its PC counterpart. Several missions, particularly those on Venus and Titan, are plagued by heavy fog, and those without fog, such as Europa and Io, you will be able to see the map being drawn ahead of you at times. The skyboxes are also totally hit or miss, being very cool in some stages and hilariously low quality in others. On the moon in Europa, for example, you can see bends and folds in the texture as it was stretched across the sky. Stages like Titan and Io, however, actually managed to be kind of neat, as they try to portray what it would be like to stand on the surface of these moons. On Io, the massive Jupiter takes up the majority of the sky, as it likely would in real life if you were to go to Io. Likewise, you can see a giant Saturn visible in the hazy Titan sky. On Venus, you can't see the sky, or really anything for that matter, as the planet is covered in ugly mustard-colored fog. This can be forgiven because that's pretty much what the actual Venus looks like, according to all data we've recovered. The tanks themselves look okay enough, I guess, but definitely not as sharp as the PC version. Terrain and buildings are also nothing special either. Thankfully, the game's reticule, when activated, will show you what each building and vehicle you're looking at is, since it isn't always obvious what each one does just by its appearance. Speaking of the reticule, let's talk about troop management in this version. Since this game has a heavy RTS element, selecting units and issuing commands will be something you'll be doing a lot of. The PC game used a simple menu in conjunction with the mouse. The N64 tries to replicate that functionality, but since you won't have a keyboard with hotkeys, it has to solely be done with button presses. The command menu is still in the top left like the PC version, but it's brought up by pressing the D-pad button. This opens a command menu that you can scroll through with the D-pad. Each unit type has a tab, and selecting one and hitting right again opens the command menu for that unit. For all your offensive and defensive units, they get their own tab. When you click offensive, you're shown a list of all the offensive tanks currently under your command, and clicking one of them lets you issue orders to that tank alone. Like the PC version, there's still no way to issue orders en masse, so if you want your tanks to go attack an enemy structure, you'll have to select each one of them one by one and ask them to go attack. This can cause trouble in time-critical situations, or if you have a lot of tanks, it can make it difficult to have them attack in unison. Faster tanks, or tanks at the top of the list, will make it to the target first, and if they encounter resistance, will be outright destroyed or take heavy damage, dampening the efficiency of their assault. If you're planning on assaulting an enemy encampment, it's often better just to have all of them follow you directly, since they'll automatically fire on enemy hostiles anyway. Once enemy tanks have been cleared up, you can direct them to fire on enemy buildings after resistance has been mopped up. Building things is more cumbersome on the N64 as well. The PC version would have you select a building and then use a mouse to select where to drop it. If the reticule on the ground turns red, you can't build there due to terrain. If it's yellow, you could build there, but you don't have power, so you need to build power first. And green means you're good to go. You have to select where to drop buildings with the same control stick you use to move in both games. But the N64 analog stick is much less precise than a PC mouse. It works okay for driving and shooting in the tanks, but it's not made for hyper-precise terrain selection. And Battlezone is often very picky about where it lets you place buildings, requiring absolutely flat terrain with no bumps or jutting out geometry anywhere close to the build site. This again can cost you critical time in life or death situations, as you'll often be in a hurry to get defenses set before enemies that are already en route to kill you can destroy your base. Going on foot is also a mixed bag in this version. For some reason, while on foot, the camera will force itself down at the ground, meaning you have to tap up every few seconds to look where you're going. It's a bizarre choice, and I'm not sure why Climax did this. Sniping is easier here than on the PC version though, at least. The PC version displayed a somewhat hard to see glowing circle of where you had to hit to snipe a pilot, but this version makes a flashing rainbow square appear over the cockpit that makes it much easier to hit your mark. Climax also played around with the difficulty a little bit for the console release. Even on medium, the PC Battlezone can be fairly unforgiving, and the HD Remaster's Red Odyssey campaign is outright nasty on even the default setting. The PC versions, however, do allow for saving during a mission at any point, so you can always save and retry at strategic points to get through it. But this ability is lost for the console version, and there are no checkpoints, meaning we're going by GoldenEye/Perfect Dark mission rules. If you fail the mission or die, you start all the way over from the beginning. Battlezone also kicks you out to the menu when you fail, usually with a message about how bad you are and how it's your fault the United States lost the war. You can't even drive around the map in a fail state to scout ahead for your next attempt. Some of these missions can be 20 or 30 minutes long when you're trying to figure out what the game wants you to do, so this can be very painful at times. Luckily, Climax seems to have figured that out, and they reduce the enemy health and the rate at which weapons are exhausted, which is one of my main complaints with the PC Battlezone. Enemies can be fairly tanky, pun intended, and weapons run out fast. This makes you less likely to try any of the harder hitting and unique weapons, and instead stick to reliable standbys like the at-stabber and minigun. Since ammo goes further in the console version, you'll be able to try out a few of these weapons without feeling so worried about your ammo. Still though, they didn't do much to balance out the weapons either. Battlezone has a ton of unique weapon types. Once you have access to the armory, you can make these for yourself at will and have them launched to your position. This sounds good on paper as you can get nearly any weapon on any mission, but sadly a large quantity of these have very niche uses that aren't worth replacing your standard AT stabber or chain gun with. If you're doing a mission where you're mainly defending your territory, it might be worth plopping down a supply and giving yourself one of the higher damage ammo eating weapons, but usually you'll stick to the basics. I'm not an expert on BZ multiplayer either, so perhaps some of these lesser used weapons like shadowers and splinter mines and other things are used in multiplayer matches and just ended up in the console version by nature of being ported. I don't really know what to say about the game's music either. It's composed by Matthew "Format" Simmons, a chiptune composer who has a long list of composer credits in the game industry in addition to his own original works. In order to cram this game into an N64 cartridge, the music had to take a hit in quality. The PC version used synthesized orchestra-type instruments for an OST made mainly up of military marches and the heat of battle type tracks. Format recreated most of these using the game's very unusual sound font, but they take on a whole new feel of their own thanks to the N64's lower quality. I'm not even really sure how to describe it. They're definitely low quality samples to fit on the N64 that's already stretched to the max, but somehow in the context of this game's somewhat muddy visuals, they kind of work. I've seen other reviews dog the sound, but I actually really like it, and the otherworldly type vibe it gives off at times. The N64 Battlezone's muddied graphics was great at making the childhood mind fill in the gaps, and the strange music sometimes hits at just the right time, as you've been ejected from your tank and are walking alone through a barren planet trying to find your way. It's annoying and you're one step from losing, but oddly enough, these strange moments listening to the weird music and walking across an alien world alone are what I remember the most from Battlezone, and the music, as simple as it may be, just kind of makes that work. Rise of the Black Dogs is a flawed port, but if you don't have a way to play the PC version and an N64 is all you have, then you could certainly do a lot worse. Rise of the Black Dogs takes the core premise of the PC version and executes it successfully on the N64. However, the memory limitations hamper the experience somewhat, and much of the console-exclusive content isn't as well put together as that from the PC offering. It's somewhat strange that Crave chose to focus the game's title around the Black Dogs when their campaign isn't really even the focus, but more of a thrown-together bonus. Any beginner who picked this game up and thought they should play the Black Dogs route first was likely disappointed by the game and overwhelmed by the difficulty. Not to keep harping on the Black Dog thing, but the Black Dogs were already playable and had their own campaign in 1999's The Red Odyssey, which was an expansion to the original game. Rise of the Black Dogs came out in 2000, so perhaps there just wasn't time, or they knew that if they included the Black Dog campaign from Red Odyssey, they'd have to include the Chinese campaign as well, and since the N64's limitations were a thing, it just wasn't going to happen. Therefore, the OG Black Dog faction got its chance to shine. I went and played the Red Odyssey some more via Battlezone 98 Redux Remaster, and I can see why Crave didn't touch it. It sucks. The gameplay is still the same and the graphics and music are pretty darn good for 98, but the mission design is atrocious. The solve-it-your-way approach from the original campaign is gone, in favor of missions with ramped-up difficulty and usually only one so-called correct way to solve a problem. Most of the missions are so brutal that they require you to have played them before and have your units in place before mission-based events happen. Otherwise, you'll fail because something will be destroyed or die or get lost before you can even reach it. Combine this with the game's characters telling you how you lost the entire war and it was your fault that humanity is doomed to communism in space, and you get a recipe for an expansion that unfortunately pales in comparison to its predecessor campaign. I have no doubt that this port introduced a ton of N64 owners to this game, many of which who later went on to try the PC version and become Battlezone fans. Any game that gives me a chance to traipse across a semi-correctly designed solar system and fight communism in space is a win in my book.